Hello, everybody, and welcome back to another episode. Today, I'm thrilled to be joined by kind of like a veteran on the channel now. It is none other than my good friend from All For United and All For Women's Football, Connor Roberts. Connor, how are you doing today?
Yes, so good. Thanks for having me back on the second time. I know, getting two appearances now. It's starting to rack up a little bit.
I know it's weird. It feels like it's more than two appearances just because of how often we talk about football, but it is a second appearance here. And we're back, obviously, talking about United. The season has just wrapped up. The summer transfer window chats are already wrapping up. But before we jump into the summer chats and kind of like how are United expected to approach this window, I want to take it back to last season. Certainly ups and downs, you could say. The FA Cup win was a huge up, the first in their history. They kind of used a lot of that upset, kind of sad feelings from the FA final beforehand, the loss to Chelsea, and kind of came out with guns blazing and beat Spurs in that FA Cup final to win the FA Cup. However, it was not as glorious and not as beautiful, one would say, in the WSL as they finished in their fifth, or they finished in the fifth spot of the table. 10 wins, 7 losses, 5 draws, and they conceded 32 goals. So I guess we can start talking about the WSL here and going into last season. There's obviously a lot of huge expectations. They had just come off one of, or arguably their most successful season to date. Were in the title race until the final day against Chelsea, and that's not necessarily what we saw this last season. But going into that season that we just completed, there was a few transfer windows, just kind of sagas that happened. Final day bids, panic, maybe buys. How did you assess their summer transfer window business now that you have seen those players in action?
It's a strange one because I think on paper, our squad, we all said at the start of the season, looking at United, that it was actually stronger on paper. We felt as fans looking at it. Obviously, there was a couple of noticeable absentees from the 11. Obviously, with Honor and Alessia moving on, they were the two big ones from the 11. But
Yeah.
other than that, we didn't lose too many from the 11. A lot of the players, it was made into a big thing. I think it was 14, 16 players that left last summer. A lot of them weren't starters. A lot of them were kind of rotation players. Some of them weren't even in the first squad, in the match day squad for a lot of it.
Hmm.
However, so we kind of looked at it like that. But as the season went on, obviously we lost Gabby George very early, Emma Watson the same, kind of before the season even got going. So we didn't even see those two throughout the season. Miyazawa also picked up an injury, just before the winter break as well. So she was out for a couple of months, so we didn't see her. So three of the signings we didn't get to see anyway for most of the season due to injury. Obviously, Fallon's the other one, goalkeeper, didn't see too much game time either because Mary Earps is the WSL keeper. She didn't play in the FA Cup either, which was a bit of a disappointment. I can't lie. I thought Fallon would
Huge
at least play the FA
disappointment.
Cup, especially with the
Huge.
games that we had early on, Newcastle and Southampton and the likes of. You would think she'd get games there, but she didn't. So she only played Conti Cup. And then obviously you're looking at the big money. Obviously, Jace on the right hand side again probably didn't hit the heights that we maybe thought that she might do. Don't get me wrong, exceptional to watch, amazing on the
Yeah.
ball. Her technical ability is one of the best I've seen in a United shirt. But I think when we look back at the season, only a couple of goals, couple of assists. We probably going into next season certainly expect a lot more of her.
Mhm.
Maybe a year to bed in a little bit, but yeah, definitely feel like she's gonna have to. I feel like I've missed somebody. Melvin Mallard,
Buffalo.
of course, because she
Yeah.
was only a loanee. I was thinking of all the purchase players. Yeah, she's been exceptional. The United fans have absolutely taken, and she's taken to United like you'd think she'd been here for years, and is a massive United fan. The way she's
Yeah.
embraced Manchester United, and it's going to be such a shame should she not return next season. Obviously, that's so clearly up to her and
Hmm.
obviously the two clubs to agree something if she's to come back. 'Cause it was only a 1 year loan, but
Yeah.
yeah, I'm going to be gutted personally if she doesn't come back because she has been exceptional on the pitch, but also off
Hmm.
it as well.
Well, also another one of the transfers, and we'll also get to talk to her a little bit more, but it was Irene Guerrero with a swap deal of Boa Risa. Now, I think a consistent opinion that I've heard, and very consistent in what you've said too, is that we've done great signings. There's been great players coming in, some of the best really in the game here, coming over to United, and retrospectively it looked like a much better squad. But we have not seen the best out of those players. Is that down to just them and I'm quoting Mark Skinner on this, having to learn the WSL way. Is this them just kind of adjusting into things and just taking too long of a time? Or is this down to the coaching staff that is just not able to get the best out of those players?
I think it's the latter, to be honest. I completely forgot about Irene Guerrero until you mentioned it, purely because we've not seen her play.
Yeah,
I think in the WSL, when you're looking at her minutes, it's got to be, I don't even know what it is off the top of my head, but I feel like it's below 60,
yeah,
across the whole of the
probably.
WSL. I don't think we've seen her play
And
at
not to
all, really.
mention, she's a World Cup winner too,
And you
right?
don't just get into that Spain squad, especially in midfield, by the way, if you're not a half decent player. So the fact that and it's looking potentially likely, obviously at the time of recording, she's potentially on the way out as well. So,
Hmm.
you're looking at a player that we moved Vilde Boerissa on, and obviously there was discussions around potentially her not even wanting to leave. And
Yeah.
the way that that happened and the way that she was essentially, I guess, pushed out of the club, that's the only terminology I can use,
Mm.
and bringing in a player, which, to be fair, at the time you'd look at on paper again, bit of a like for like, fair enough, and we've not seen. So
Hmm.
I think that's a massive disappointment. I think when they go away over the summer, I think the coaches will probably look at how to get the best out of a lot of these players, and the players they're bringing in have got to fit into the system. We can't have another year of I'm going to call it transition, because you can't have another year of players needing to adapt into it, because you're constantly going to be in that cycle of players needing to adapt every single season.
Hmm. Yeah, I think it's always been kind of like a sticky time where they bring in exceptional players. And again, Guerrero is a player. I mean, she's a Spanish midfielder. That title on its own should just bring you so much kind of extra oomph of how you play football. And for a manager to consistently come out and say, well, she needs to adjust to the WSL, is it feels like a bit of a diss to her almost. Where then a player is like, well, we're kind of almost to the end of the season and I haven't even gone an hour of playtime. Like what's happening here? So she looks like she's on the way out, like you mentioned, as the time of the recording. Maybe that's already announced by the time we put this out. But we'll get to talk about transfers in just a moment because I'm sure we'll get to talk about the summer window. Overall performances. We saw a stellar performance down for the books against Chelsea in the FA Cup semi-final. The first time that United has beaten Chelsea, and I think that was, from a neutral's perspective, a really, really fun game because I think any neutral is always rooting for the underdog, and to see the underdog come up against the WSL champions like that, that was something. Now, on the final day of the WSL, well, Chelsea defeated United 6-0 at Old Trafford. We have seen a very, very inconsistent level of performances. Why are we seeing that? Because I think something that they were categorized with the season beforehand was that they were very consistent. And this season, they are just, or last season, they were just incredibly inconsistent.
I think when you were saying stellar performance against Chelsea, I was thinking, hang on, are you talking about Old Trafford or the
No.
final hit? Because it definitely wasn't at Old
Yeah.
Trafford. Um, yeah, I really don't. I can't. We've been trying to debate and discuss this over the last kind of few weeks in terms of our inconsistency. Because when you were reading out the WSL table a bit earlier on, obviously how many draws and the losses, and you think of some of the draws at the start of the season to Leicester, to Brighton, drew at home to Arsenal very early on with the late goal at LSV. So there's been so many draws in there that potentially last season we drew at home to Spurs, drew away to West Ham, and then we've lost pretty much against the top four, obviously because we've lost to Liverpool both times as well
Yeah.
in this case. So I think there's definitely an element of teams who got stronger. Liverpool are a much better team the season just gone than they were the season prior.
Mm.
However, I think we've regressed quite a fair amount as well. Um, you look at our record against the top four, only 1 point, I think the year before was 15.
Yeah.
That's a massive drop. You even take half of those amount of points, you take 8 in those games, we're pretty much on the cusp of the top four. So, on the top three, sorry. So there's an element of that when you look at it. I think, again, like I said, obviously players coming in and out, bit of unrest with certain players. Obviously, I know I keep going back to the transfer window, but you look at the likes of Mary Oates, for example, there was probably a bit of unrest around her at the start of the season because she was looking like she was going to leave and ended up staying, potentially against what she wanted.
Hmm.
Um, and players just not settling. And I think when you've got that, and I use it a lot, but I think when you've got the season prior, you had Martin Ho, who for me was a bit of like a shield for Mark Skinner. So
Mm.
Mark knew he could kind of do what he's doing this year. I don't think he's changed his approach, but I think you had that buffer there. You had a
Mm.
bit of a middleman essentially between the players and the manager, This
Hmm.
season, because that's gone, Charlotte and Dan have stepped up again, good coaches in their own right, but I don't think they're to the level of what Martin was. And I think when you have that communication drop off, and again, obviously Mark is known a lot of the players, Lucia Garcia, and if you recently just say spoke about him being very intense.
Hmm.
Leah Galton's done interviews with Pat Katie Zellen when he first came in, said the way he communicates confuses players at times.
Yeah.
So I think when you lose that communicator in Martin, and a very good coach, we've seen what he's done since he's moved on, obviously over in Norway, amazing things over there.
Mm.
I think that's been a big change as well. So looking ahead, I think that's something not just the playing squad. I think they need to look at the coaching staff as well. Because we know Mark's going to be here for next season, obviously with that extension he signed recently.
Yeah.
So they need to start looking at putting a team around him. I think if they're going to keep him for next season, which obviously they are, they need to look at potentially bringing people in that can help him along.
Yeah, I'm glad you bring up that contract extension because I know your opinion has been, well, their main talk almost was not are we going to keep him, is like how long are we going to keep him for? And so obviously they decided on the contract length, which correct me if I'm wrong, but it is a year. Um, any surprise in that? Any feelings to, especially after seeing that 6-0 defeat at home, which by the way, let's put this on the record. No team that is striving to compete in the top three should be losing 6-0 at home at Old Trafford. That
It,
is unacceptable. Just unacceptable. Um, so certainly not the way that he wanted to wrap up the season going into next season when there was a fair amount of doubters about his stint because like you mentioned, players have been open about maybe him not being the smoothest communicator with them.
No, and I think for me, as bad as this, like as amazing as the FA Cup was, it was an absolutely incredible day. Like I said, first major
Mm,
trophy. Obviously, I know we got the championship. Obviously, we got promoted, but the first big major trophy and a historic one as well. You know, for the women's FA Cup for a lot of people was their first way into women's football in the UK. So, you know, it's a massive trophy to win. And then the manner that we lost in what you just said, obviously, the Mark Skinner contract news came out the day before. You know, United announced it the day before that, so there was already a bit of unrest, and then we go into that game, and that's the worst I think I've ever seen a United women's team play. It's our biggest ever defeat. The previous one being 6-1, also against Chelsea and the Mark Skinner at home,
yeah.
albeit at LSV that time. So that was not for him, and I don't think this is going to sound a bit bad, I think, but like I don't think he helped himself in his post-match press conference either. I
No.
think when you lose 6-0, all fans want to hear is just I'm sorry or we're sorry, like the team's sorry for what we just saw and so on. And he said that, to be fair, he did say, you know, we're sorry to the fans, and then went on this. I don't know what to call it, but talking about fans, the intelligent fans know where we are in the league and see the progress and things like that. I can't remember the exact quote, but it was definitely talking about intelligent fans know where we are. And I
Mm,
remember seeing that. I was stood in the Munich tunnel outside the ground reading the quotes that were coming through, and it's like, yes, we know where we are as fans. It's our lowest ever points finish. That's our biggest ever defeat. That's the reality of where we are right now. So although the FA Cup was amazing, you know, as I said, I'll never change it. You know, if you could say to me before, like you're going to lose the final game of the season 6-0, but you win the FA Cup, 100% I'm taking the FA Cup because
yeah.
I would never want to change that day. But it does take a bit of a shine off it,
Hmm.
I feel like, because it's like it was such a party atmosphere before that game,
Yeah.
and it just took a big like. If we'd have lost, you know, fair enough. Chelsea were going for the league. We weren't fighting for
Hmm.
anything. You lose 2-0, 3-0, fine, whatever. But to lose in the manner that we did, and we could have been more. I think the only
Yeah.
reason it wasn't is because when it got to 5, Chelsea just went, well, we've won the league now. We don't need to to do anything else.
Yeah.
And I think so. It definitely took a bit of a dent. So going back to your very original question. Sorry, I'm rambling on a bit.
No,
Going back to your
that
original point
yeah.
about my thoughts on whether he got off when he got offered the deal. I can see why the club did it because there's a lot of overhaul needs to be done with the structure above Mark Skinner. That on the men's side, there's doubts over Erik ten Hag at the moment.
Mm,
There's a lot of structure changes on the men's side as well.
yeah.
They're obviously coming. There's transfers to sort out. There's contracts to sort out. So I can understand it from a business point of view, keeping him for a year. However, there's always this talk of who would you bring in if you get rid of him? Any manager's available if you've got the money and can prize them away by selling them the project. So for me, that's a bit of a cop out saying that there wasn't anyone available because there always is. You can go
Yeah.
and get any manager if you want them and you sell them the project. So I think they could have got someone else. I think they probably will when his contract ends in a year's time.
Hmm.
Essentially, he's on performance review for a year and just see how he does. And to be fair, if we go on and win the league, some would argue he deserves another contract after that because you want to win the league after winning the FA Cup the year prior.
Yeah.
It's a pretty good argument. But if United had the kind of season we've just had, where we drop down and we finish fourth or fifth again, they certainly shouldn't be extending that past the next year.
You saying that this next year is going to be performance review, like essentially he's on probation, is really a very, very accurate way of putting it. And I guess a big cloud question from the season that they were title, contenders to now was that title run season just an outlier, or is this season the outlier? Which one is the outlier? Or is this just a regular hurdle on the way when a team is trying to figure out their best players, their best system, their best structure? Like you mentioned, there is changing in the ownership, board level. We'll also get to talk about Paulie in a moment. But is there an outlier that we're seeing here, or do you assess this as a natural way of how a team progresses from a very high to a very low? And that's it's a cliche you hear with the players and head and managers that you go through highs and lows, and that's how the game is. Is this really what we're seeing this season?
No, because I think you could look at both as anomalies because,
Mm,
I mean, when United broke into the top three the season before last, it was the first time, I believe, for about 10 years since anyone else other than Chelsea, Arsenal, City had broke into the top three. So it had been a while of that traditional top three, and United broke into it. So you could argue that was an anomaly.
hmm.
However, going back to reality for United would have been dropping to fourth and on the cusp of top three this season. The fact that we finished fifth and 15 points away from the top three, that's a massive gap. So not only have United dropped probably back to where I thought United would finish third this season, and I
Hmm.
didn't think we'd have a title charge. And I thought we'd do well in the FA Cup again. But I didn't expect the levels drop that we saw to the point where Liverpool overtaking the Spurs were right on our heels as well. We could have
Hmm.
very easily finished sixth if we weren't careful towards the end of the season. So it's definitely been a huge drop, a much bigger drop, I think, than fans expected this season. When you have the summer window, you have the biggest spenders in the WSL. You come off the back of an FA Cup final and pushing Chelsea to the last game of the season. You would hope that next season you would at least do something. And I do wonder, this is purely hypothetical and thinking theories here.
Yeah.
I do wonder what would have happened if United would have beaten PSG and got into the group stage of the Champions League. Maybe how different the season might have been. Because it might have been worse. I don't know,
Yeah.
but I think just looking back around that time, we drew with Leicester. Then not long after that, we drew with Brighton, lost to Liverpool. It seemed to just all unravel after that game, the away game at PSG, because we were actually okay in that game. I think when we're looking at it objectively, we look back at that game, we actually played some good football, and we've played
Hmm.
good football at times this season. I think that's what's really frustrating. You mentioned the semi-final; it's there, it's in us to have a good performance, but we've just not seen it over. There's been too many games.
Consistent.
Liverpool away
Yeah.
was an awful watch. Even Leicester away, we won that game from a fantastic Ella Toon strike, but we
Yeah.
were poor in that game as well. So we've not been good for majority of the season.
Yeah, I remember after that game, I was like, "So, how was the goal?" And you were like, "Other than the goal, it's pretty boring, I have to admit." Um, but yeah, I think you're right. The run of games after the PSG defeat was it almost felt like a domino effect from that loss. But going now into the new season, into the transfer window, we know Paulie from the head of women's football is gone. But unfortunately, we're still seeing similar reports of, Irene Guerrero kind of she's moving on. Rachel Williams feeling undervalued. Few of the players, I know you can touch on that, but some big names perhaps leaving the squad. Again, a little bit of unrest of the contract situation. Though we've seen a change in personnel at the head of things, we haven't seen a change in the discourse of how these contracts are approached.
Yeah, and I think that's a big worry when we're looking at all the players that are currently out. Again, by the at the time, I can only go off of the time of recording this. By the time this is out, potentially we may have had United may have announced a couple of outgoings. But I think
Hmm.
when you've got the amount of players out of contract as United have this summer, and it's looking at the moment likely that none of them are going to re-sign for next season. That's a big worry. And just from an outside point of view, if you're looking at United going, well, they've not been able to retain anyone that was out of contract. That's a big worry. I know that United retained a few players throughout the season. Galton, Blundell, and Hayley Ladd were the three, and obviously Mela Cissio as
Hmm.
well. But she wasn't out of contract until next year. It does worry me. you hear the same stories around United all the time from top reporters reporting on United that it's always United move too slow. They're always one of the first clubs in there when starting negotiations, but it's always too slow. There's too many people. There's too many. It just always seems too complicated. And you hear stories
Hmm.
from from agents and things like that United are just really difficult to deal with. So I hope under the new structure, potentially moving forward, that is going to change. Obviously, we've got an interim guy in at the moment who's
Hmm.
dealing with these kinds of things. So that makes me think a little bit that they're looking long term, that they want someone proper in place for that position and putting a proper structure there.
Yeah.
That's what I hope. What I worry is they're going to be happy with just interim in their way through the next kind of year or so, and just kick the can down the road. And by that point, your key players could have left because
Hmm.
yes, we've got key players potentially leaving this summer, but you go to the next summer. If Grace Clinton comes back, she's out of contract next year. Jay Rivier's out of contract. Millie Turner's out of contract. We've got a lot of players next season that also need to be
Yeah.
They need to be starting looking at those renewals now if they're not already, because we're going to be in the same situation in 12 months' time where we're like, how couldn't we? Why couldn't we keep hold of Jade? Why couldn't we keep
Yeah.
hold of Grace and all these kinds of players?
Hmm. I want to make this chat a little bit kind of more positive. So I want to ask you three key questions here. First question is, who for you was the goal of the season?
I mean, that's an easy one, right? It's
Yeah.
Toon at Wembley. I don't even need to think. I mean, Toon, to be fair, like could just have highlights on her own. She's
Yeah.
got a banger against Brighton, against Leicester, Newcastle, the Wembley one. Like you could argue that it's got to be that one. Millie Turner against West Ham's a close second though.
Yeah. Yeah, Toonie definitely has some bangers in her locker, pun intended. Who would you say is, or would you rate as the best player of the season?
This is
Granted,
a
I'll give you some space and give you a runner up here.
this is a really tough one because and I'm not just saying this because I'm on your channel. I know this is by your background that this is going to sound a bit biased. As a performer, when she's played, Jade Riviere for me has been the best player this season. However, can she be considered player of the season if she's not played for
All of it.
parts of it throughout injury and things like that? So I would argue she has been the best when she's played. Garcia probably, towards the back end. It's weird because you've got players like Nikita Paris who started the first half of the season really well,
Hmm.
didn't end great. Tooney didn't start the season well, but ended great. Garcia's kind of been in and out, but has been quite good over the season. So I would be torn between. I know you said two, but I'm torn between three. I'd be torn between Jade, Lucia, and Ella Toon, to be honest,
Mm,
because I don't think anyone's been consistent through the whole season.
yep.
But I think those three in particular have had good seasons when they've played.
I do appreciate the Jade shout out. I think injuries aside, and I think what's been really impressive too when she comes back from injury, she kind of shakes off that rust fairly quickly. She doesn't have to go through that adaptation period that Skinner so loves to highlight. And she's kind of quick into the action. So, yeah, thrilled to see Jade obviously feel so comfortable. And she had big shoes to fill. Ivana Battier, obviously, nobody's going to be able to replace a player like Battier, but I think Jade has done herself justice in the performances. The last moment here, or the last question I want to ask here is, what would you say was the highlight of the season for you? Was it a specific moment? Was there a specific game? Just a day, I guess, that stands out to you of like that really puts this season as a special season for you?
Um, I've got two, and they're both FA Cup related, which is not going to be a surprise. Because it's weird because the Chelsea semi-final win, I think felt at the time that felt like a bigger win than the final. That felt like the final, winning the
Hmm.
semis, because it was like we'd never beaten Chelsea. Most United fans go in there, we were like, we're going just because we love the team and we want to go and support them and things like that. So I definitely think the Chelsea semi-final was such a big moment to get over that mental hurdle of beating Chelsea for the first time, and just hanging on for 45 minutes. Anyone who follows, obviously, we all love football. If you're watching your team just hanging on for that long
Yeah.
time, it's not good for your heart rate. And then obviously the final. I don't think if I could relive a moment, like everyone's that whole United end 12, 13,000, whatever it was, and at Wembley, all seeing country roads, watching the United players lifting the tray. It was like that moment for me was just amazing. I don't think we'll let. Like I said, it's a bit dented because of the 6-0, and I wish it was the other way around. I wish we'd have lost to Chelsea and then won the cup because it would feel a
Hmm.
little different.
Mm.
Um, yeah, that moment with everybody, and just seeing players that have been there since the start. Tooney and Zell, Leah, and Millie Turner that have been through everything with United. since 2018,
Hmm.
since the team reformed. Seeing them have that moment with the trophy and everything else, I thought was a special one. And like I said, if that's going to be some player's last game and signing off, it's not a bad way to sign off. Lucia Garcia, if she's
Yeah.
ended up leaving, it's not a bad way to sign off for 2 goals in the cup final.
No, she won player of the match that game too. It's yeah, if there's a farewell or cherry on top she wants to put in with her time at United, that's the way to put it. Connor, I also want to give a huge shout out for folks who are not following Connor and all the work he does. Connor has been doing some exceptional work on his All For United Women's channel. 2 uploads a week, 2 shows a week, back to back to back, always on top of things, putting on some of the best shows when it comes to the game. Brutally honest with the performances that he's seen at United. I don't think you missed a single game this season, have you?
No, and we said this on Monday's show. Fair play to all of our contributors who came on and the viewers, to be fair, and obviously people like yourself that support the channel because it's been a really tough season doing reviews on games that we maybe didn't want to do a review on, but
Yeah,
we
did
have done every single one.
did miss a single game, was in the crowds for every single one. If there's people that we really should appreciate and highlight in the women's space, it's definitely Connor and all his work. So with all being said, you need to go check out his work. He's also been doing more TikToks now. So if you're a social media gal, boy, whatever it may be, head over there. Connor, thank you so much for joining me today to talk about all things United. There's probably nobody else that I would have wanted to have on to talk about the Red Devils. And yeah, we shall see what next season cooks up for us. I'm sure I'll have you on before the season kicks off, and we'll get to talk more about the transfers that we'll get to see because United in the transfer window is a storyline that you just never gets old.
Oh, for sure. No, thanks for having me on. It's been a great chat to all things United. And like I said, obviously keep an eye on United over the summer because I'll tell you, if there's a club as a neutral that you're going to want to keep an eye on, there's going to be lots of ins and outs. So keep an eye on United because it's going to be, as United fans, a bit of a bumpy ride. For neutrals, it's probably going to be quite fun to watch.
Yep, there you go.